At 0630 hours on June 6, 1944, Private Robert Miller of the 29th Infantry Division crouched in a landing craft approaching Omaha Beach. He was 21 years old. He had trained for this moment for 2 years. But nothing in training had prepared him for the sound he was hearing over the roar of the boat engines and the crash of artillery. It was a ripping sound, like fabric being torn, fast, too fast to be individual gunshots. It sounded like a buzzsaw cutting through wood. The sound came from the cliffs above the beach. Multiple sources, overlapping, constant. That was an MG42, the German machine gun that American intelligence officers had warned about during briefings. The weapon that fired 1,200 rounds per minute, 20 rounds per second. So fast that you couldn't hear individual shots, just one continuous ripping sound. Miller's landing craft was 200 meters from the beach. The ramp would drop in approximately 60 seconds. He would have to run across 300 meters of open beach while those guns fired at him. The MG42s were positioned in concrete bunkers on the cliffs. They had overlapping fields of fire covering the entire beach. There was no cover, no place to hide. The soldier next to Miller was Private James Harrison from Ohio. Harrison was 19 years old. This was his first combat. He was gripping his M1 Garand rifle so hard his knuckles were white. He looked at Miller and shouted over the noise, "What is that sound?" Miller shouted back, "MG42, Hitler's buzzsaw. Keep your head down when the ramp drops." The landing craft lurched as a wave hit the bow. The coxswain was trying to get as close to the beach as possible, but German artillery was falling in the water all around them. Explosions sent geysers of water 50 feet high. Shrapnel ripped through the air. The boat to their left took a direct hit and exploded. Men were thrown into the water. Some didn't surface. At 0632, the landing craft's ramp dropped. Water rushed in. The ramp was in 5 feet of water. Miller jumped and went under. He came up gasping, struggling to keep his rifle above water. Around him, men were jumping from the boat, trying to wade toward the beach. The MG42s opened fire immediately. The sound was everywhere, constant, unending. Bullets struck the water, creating splashes that looked like rain hitting a pond. Men were hit before they reached the beach. They fell into the water and didn't get up. Miller waded forward. The water was chest deep. Each step was difficult. His equipment weighed 60 pounds. The current pulled at him. He could see the beach 150 meters ahead. He could see dead soldiers floating in the water. He could see men trying to reach the beach, falling, not moving. Harrison was behind him. Miller could hear him breathing hard, struggling through the water. They had trained together. They had crossed the Atlantic together. Now they were trying to cross 150 meters of beach while German machine guns fired at them. A burst from an MG42 hit the water 3 feet to Miller's right. The bullets traveled through the water, leaving trails of bubbles. Another burst hit the water to his left. The gunners were walking fire back and forth across the beach approaches, creating interlocking fields that nothing could cross alive. Miller reached waist-deep water. He started moving faster. He could see other soldiers ahead of him who had reached the beach and were taking cover behind a low seawall. That was the objective. Get to the seawall, get out of the MG42's field of fire. He ran. Harrison ran beside him. The beach was sand and gravel. Bodies were everywhere. Equipment was scattered. The MG42 fire was constant. The sound was overwhelming. Miller couldn't think. He could only run. He was 50 meters from the seawall when Harrison went down. Miller didn't see what hit him. Harrison was running, then he fell forward and didn't move. Miller wanted to stop, wanted to help, but stopping meant dying. He kept running. He reached the seawall and threw himself down behind it. Other soldiers were already there, pressed against the concrete, trying to make themselves as small as possible. The MG42 fire continued overhead. Bullets hit the seawall with metallic pings. The sound of 1,200 rounds per minute striking concrete was like a jackhammer. Miller looked back at the beach. Bodies covered the sand. Men were still coming out of the water, still trying to reach the seawall. Most didn't make it. The MG42s cut them down in the open. The gun positions on the cliffs had perfect visibility. They could see the entire beach. There was no way to approach without being seen, no way to advance without being shot. A sergeant pressed against the seawall next to Miller shouted, "We need to take out those guns. They're killing everyone." Miller nodded. But how? The MG42 positions were in concrete bunkers 100 meters up the cliff. They were protected by thick walls and embrasures that limited the angle of return fire. Direct assault was suicide. Artillery couldn't reach them because the bunkers were built into the cliff face. Naval gunfire had tried to destroy them before the landing but had failed. The bunkers were still there. The guns were still firing. The sergeant pointed at a ravine that cut through the cliff. "That's our way up. We get infantry up that ravine, we can flank those positions. But someone has to suppress those guns while we move." Miller understood. Someone had to draw fire from the MG42s. Someone had to make the German gunners focus on targets in the open while others advanced. Someone had to die so others could live. The machine gun that was firing at Miller's section of beach was an MG42 in a position designated WN62 by German defenders. The gun was operated by Obergefreiter Franz Gockel, age 23, from Munich. Gockel had been manning that position since 0400 hours. He had watched the Allied fleet approach through the darkness. He had seen the landing craft heading toward the beach. He had waited for them to get close. When the landing craft ramps dropped, Gockel opened fire. His MG42 was loaded with a 250-round belt. He fired in short bursts, 5 to 10 rounds per trigger pull, walking fire across the beach approaches. The gun's rate of fire was so high that even short bursts put multiple rounds on target. He could see soldiers falling in the water. He could see them falling on the beach. He continued firing. The MG42 had been delivered to his unit 3 months earlier, replacing the older MG34 machine guns they had been using. Gockel had trained extensively with the weapon. He knew its capabilities. He knew how to change barrels when they overheated. He knew how to clear jams. He knew how to maintain the gun's incredible rate of fire. The MG42 fired 7.922 57mm Mauser ammunition, the same cartridge used by German rifles. Standard load was a 250-round belt, though 50-round drum magazines could also be used. The gun weighed 11.6 kilograms unloaded. It was air-cooled with a quick-change barrel system that allowed overheated barrels to be replaced in seconds. The rate of fire was approximately 1/200 rounds per minute. This was significantly faster than any other machine gun in service in 1944. The American M1919 Browning fired 400-600 rounds per minute. The British Bren gun fired 500-600 rounds per minute. The Soviet DP-28 fired 500-600 rounds per minute. The MG42 fired twice as fast as any comparable weapon. The high rate of fire was achieved through a unique recoil-operated mechanism with a roller-locked bolt. When the gun fired, the barrel and bolt recoiled together for a short distance. Then the barrel stopped, and the bolt continued rearward, extracting the spent cartridge case. A spring drove the bolt forward, chambering a new round and locking into battery. The cycle time was approximately 50 milliseconds. The gun fired again before the previous round's recoil impulse had dissipated. This high rate of fire had several tactical effects. First, even short bursts put multiple rounds on target, increasing hit probability. Second, the sound was psychologically devastating. Soldiers couldn't hear individual shots. They heard a continuous ripping sound that indicated they were under fire from an extremely lethal weapon. Third, the gun could suppress large areas quickly. A trained gunner could fire across a 100-meter front in seconds, forcing all enemy troops to take cover. The drawbacks were ammunition consumption and barrel overheating. At 1/200 rounds per minute, a 250-round belt lasted approximately 12 seconds of continuous fire. In practice, gunners fired in bursts, extending belt life to 30 to 60 seconds. But even with burst fire, ammunition consumption was enormous. Each MG42 position required thousands of rounds to sustain defensive fire. Barrel overheating was managed through the quick-change barrel system. Each gun came with 2 barrels. When one barrel overheated, after approximately 250 rounds of sustained fire, the gunner could replace it with a cool barrel in 5 to 6 seconds. The hot barrel was set aside to cool while the gun continued firing with the replacement barrel. Gockel had already changed barrels twice since 0630. He had fired approximately 600 rounds. His assistant gunner, Gefreiter Kurt Weber, was preparing the third barrel. They had 2,000 additional rounds in ammunition boxes stacked in the bunker. They could continue firing for hours if necessary. The bunker itself was well designed for defense. Concrete walls were 1.5 meters thick. The embrasure opening was narrow, limiting the angle at which return fire could enter. The MG42 was mounted on a Lafette tripod mount that allowed traverse and elevation adjustments. The position had excellent visibility over the beach. Gockel could see the entire kill zone from his position. Weber fed a new belt into the MG42. Gockel released the bolt, chambering the first round. He aimed at a group of soldiers trying to reach the seawall and fired a 5-round burst. The gun's muzzle blast created a flash that was visible even in daylight. The bullets struck sand near the soldiers. Gockel adjusted aim and fired another burst. 2 soldiers went down. The MG42's effectiveness at Omaha Beach had been anticipated by German commanders. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel inspected the Atlantic Wall defenses in late 1943, he emphasized the need for machine gun positions with overlapping fields of fire. The MG42's high rate of fire made it ideal for defensive positions. A single gun could cover a wide front. Multiple guns with overlapping fields created a nearly impenetrable barrier. Rommel ordered the construction of numerous MG42 positions along the Normandy coast. The positions were concrete bunkers or Tobruk pits, small circular fighting positions made of concrete with an opening for the gun. The positions were sited to cover beach approaches, ravines, and any terrain feature that attacking forces might use for cover. At Omaha Beach, German defenders had emplaced approximately 85 machine gun positions, most armed with MG42s. These positions were arranged in multiple belts. The first belt covered the beach itself. The second belt covered the bluffs and ravines. The third belt covered the approaches from inland. Any attacking force would have to fight through all 3 belts while under constant machine gun fire. The design worked exactly as intended. When American forces landed at Omaha Beach, they encountered withering machine gun fire from the first moments. Landing craft were hit before soldiers could disembark. Men in the water were hit before reaching the beach. Soldiers on the beach were pinned down by continuous fire. Casualties were extremely heavy. The psychological effect of the MG42's rate of fire was significant. Soldiers who had trained with American machine guns expected to hear individual gunshots. They had learned to time their movements between bursts, but the MG42 fired so fast that there was no gap between rounds. The sound was continuous. Soldiers couldn't time their movements. They had to stay under cover continuously or risk being hit. American soldiers quickly gave the MG42 nicknames. Hitler's Buzzsaw was most common, referring to the characteristic sound. Hitler's Zipper was another, suggesting the sound of a zipper being pulled rapidly. The burp gun was used by some, though that name more commonly referred to German submachine guns. Whatever the nickname, the weapon was universally feared. After-action reports from Omaha Beach consistently mentioned the MG42's effect on the assault. Company A, 116th Infantry Regiment, landed at 0630 hours with 197 men. By 0700 hours, the company had suffered over 60% casualties, most from machine gun fire. Company commanders reported that soldiers were unable to advance due to continuous machine gun fire from multiple positions. The high rate of fire meant that any movement drew immediate fire. The solution developed during the battle was combined arms tactics. While some soldiers drew fire, others would advance using terrain features for cover. Bangalore torpedoes were used to blow gaps in wire obstacles. Engineers cleared paths through minefields. Infantry worked up the ravines under cover of suppressive fire. Navy destroyers moved close to shore and engaged bunkers with direct fire at point-blank range. By 0800 hours, some American units had reached the base of the cliffs and were beginning to flank German positions. By 0900 hours, small groups had reached the top of the bluffs. By 1000 hours, German defenders in forward positions were being overrun. The MG42 positions fell one by one as American infantry worked around their flanks. Obergefreiter Gockel in position WN62 continued firing until approximately 0945 hours. By that time, American infantry had worked up the ravine, and were approaching his position from the rear. Gockel and Weber destroyed the MG42, according to standing orders, fired their remaining ammunition, and attempted to withdraw. Both were captured approximately 200 meters from their position. Private Miller survived the landing at Omaha Beach. He advanced with his unit up the ravine and participated in clearing German positions on the bluffs. He was wounded by shell fragments on June 8, but returned to duty 2 weeks later. He fought through France and into Germany. He was discharged in November 1945 and returned to Pennsylvania. Harrison, who was hit on the beach, died of his wounds before medics could reach him. He was 19 years old. He is buried at the Normandy American Cemetery. The MG42's development had begun in 1937, when the German army recognized that the MG34, while effective, was too expensive and time-consuming to manufacture. The MG34 required extensive machining and hand-fitting of parts. Production rates were limited. The army needed a machine gun that could be mass-produced using stamping and welding techniques. Dr. Werner Gruner of Grossfuss Metallwarenfabrik led the design team. The goal was to create a machine gun with the same or better performance than the MG34, but using manufacturing methods that would allow production to scale rapidly. The design that emerged used stamped steel parts welded together rather than machined components. This reduced manufacturing time from approximately 150 hours per gun for the MG34 to approximately 75 hours for the MG42. The prototype was tested in 1939. The gun demonstrated excellent reliability and a rate of fire exceeding 1,100 rounds per minute. The German army adopted the weapon in 1942 as the MG42. Production began immediately at multiple factories. By 1943, the MG42 was being issued to frontline units across all theaters. The gun proved extremely reliable in field conditions. It functioned in desert heat, Russian cold, and European mud. The simple design and robust construction meant that even poorly trained soldiers could operate and maintain the weapon effectively. The gun's tactical employment was based on German machine gun doctrine that dated to World War I. German infantry tactics centered on the machine gun. The rifle squad existed to support the machine gun. The machine gun was the primary offensive and defensive weapon. Riflemen carried ammunition for the machine gun. Riflemen protected the machine gun position. Riflemen maneuvered to allow the machine gun to establish positions with good fields of fire. In defensive positions, German doctrine called for MG42s to be sighted with overlapping fields of fire. Multiple guns would cover the same area from different positions. If one gun was knocked out, others could continue covering that area. The guns were positioned in depth, with forward positions covering likely avenues of approach and rear positions covering fallback routes. In offensive operations, the MG42 provided suppressive fire while infantry maneuvered. The gun would fire on enemy positions, forcing defenders to take cover. While the enemy was suppressed, German infantry would advance, using terrain for cover, closing the distance. When they were close enough, they would assault the position with grenades and submachine guns, while the MG42 continued firing at adjacent positions. This doctrine worked effectively against Allied forces in 1943 and 1944. German units, even when outnumbered, could inflict heavy casualties through effective machine gun employment. A single MG42 in a good defensive position could stop an entire company's advance. Multiple MG42s working together could make positions nearly impregnable. Allied forces developed counter-tactics. The key was to identify MG42 positions and then engage them with overwhelming firepower. Artillery was most effective. A single 105mm shell landing near an MG42 position could kill the crew and destroy the gun. But calling in artillery required radio communication and forward observers, and there was often delay before fire missions were executed. Mortars were faster. An 81mm mortar could deliver high explosive rounds onto an MG42 position within minutes of the gun being identified. Mortar crews became expert at quickly computing firing solutions and dropping rounds on target. Tank support was extremely valuable. A Sherman tank's 75mm gun could destroy an MG42 position with direct fire. The tank's armor protected it from machine gun fire, allowing it to advance and engage positions that infantry couldn't approach. close air support was effective when available. Fighter bombers could strafe MG42 positions with machine guns and rockets. The German gunners had no defense against air attack except to abandon their positions. But often, especially in infantry combat without supporting arms, the only option was direct assault. This required soldiers to maneuver close enough to use grenades or satchel charges against the position. It was dangerous work. Many soldiers died trying to knock out MG42 positions. The MG42's reputation spread throughout all Allied armies. British forces first encountered the weapon in North Africa in 1942. After-action reports described the gun's exceptional rate of fire and recommended new tactics to counter it. The British developed the Universal Carrier, a small tracked vehicle that could carry an infantry section into assault positions while providing some protection from machine gun fire. Soviet forces encountered the MG42 on the Eastern Front in 1942. Soviet tactical doctrine emphasized mass assault supported by artillery. The MG42 was effective against these tactics, inflicting severe casualties on advancing Soviet infantry. Soviet commanders responded by increasing artillery preparation before assaults and using armored support whenever possible. American forces first encountered the MG42 in Tunisia in 1943. Combat reports noted the weapon's psychological effect. Soldiers who had trained to recognize the sound of the MG34 were unprepared for the much faster rate of fire of the MG42. Training was updated to include recordings of MG42 fire, so soldiers would recognize the sound in combat. The gun's mechanical reliability was remarkable. Captured MG42s were tested extensively by Allied intelligence. The weapons continued functioning after thousands of rounds were fired. They operated in sand, mud, and water. They functioned with minimal cleaning and maintenance. The design was simple enough that field repairs could be made with minimal tools. American ordnance officers studied captured MG42s to understand how the Germans achieved such high production rates. The extensive use of stamping and welding was noteworthy. American weapons typically used more machining, which required skilled workers and more time. The MG42 demonstrated that stamping could produce weapons of equal or better quality while reducing manufacturing time and cost. Post-war, several nations adopted modified versions of the MG42. The design was that good. Yugoslavia produced the M53, a 7.19 mm version nearly identical to the original MG42. Austria produced the MG74, a modernized version. Italy produced the MG42-59. Spain produced the MG45. Most significantly, West Germany adopted a modified MG42 as the MG3 in 1959. The MG3 was rechambered for 7.62 cars and 51 mm NATO ammunition, and the rate of fire was reduced slightly to approximately 1,000 rounds per minute, but the basic design remained unchanged. The MG3 remains in service with multiple armies in 2024, more than 80 years after the original design. The United States M60 machine gun, adopted in 1957, incorporated design elements from the MG42, particularly the quick-change barrel system and the feed mechanism. While not a direct copy, the M60 showed clear influence from studying captured German weapons. The MG42's legacy extended beyond its direct descendants. The weapon demonstrated that extremely high rates of fire were achievable in a reliable portable machine gun. Later weapons like the M134 minigun pushed rates of fire even higher, but the MG42 was the first weapon to demonstrate that 1,000+ rounds per minute was practical for infantry use. The tactical doctrine built around the MG42 also influenced post-war thinking. The German concept of centering infantry tactics on the machine gun was studied and in some cases adopted by other armies. The U.S. Army's squad automatic weapon concept, which led to the M249 SAW, reflected similar thinking about the importance of suppressive fire at the squad level. For the soldiers who faced the MG42 in combat, the weapon's technical specifications mattered less than its effect. They knew that when they heard that distinctive ripping sound, they were under fire from a weapon that could kill them before they could react. They knew that advancing against MG42 positions meant casualties. They knew that someone would have to die to take out each gun. The casualty statistics bore this out. Analysis of wounds treated at field hospitals showed that machine gun fire caused a significant percentage of casualties. On D-Day at Omaha Beach, the majority of casualties in the first hours were attributed to machine gun fire. Similar patterns appeared in other battles throughout the war. The psychological effect was measurable. Post-combat stress assessments found that soldiers who had been under sustained MG42 fire showed higher rates of combat fatigue than those who had faced other weapons. The continuous sound, the inability to predict when fire would come, and the knowledge that any movement might be fatal created severe stress. Some soldiers developed techniques for coping. They learned to recognize the sound patterns, understanding that the gun fired in bursts and there were brief pauses for barrel changes or reloading. They learned to time their movements to those pauses. They learned to use terrain features to mask their movement. They learned to advance in short rushes, covering 10-20 meters quickly, and then taking cover before the gunner could adjust fire. But these techniques required experience. New replacements arriving at frontline units often didn't survive their first encounter with an MG42. The veterans who had learned how to fight against the weapon could sometimes advance successfully. The inexperienced couldn't. Training was updated throughout the war to address this. By 1944, American infantry training included extensive exposure to machine gun fire. Soldiers were required to advance across ranges while live machine guns fired overhead. The goal was to acclimate them to the sound and experience of being under fire so they would be less affected psychologically in actual combat. German training for MG42 gunners emphasized sustained fire discipline. Gunners were taught to fire in short bursts, usually 5 to 7 rounds, then pause briefly to observe impact and adjust aim. This conserved ammunition and extended barrel life while maintaining suppressive effect. The psychological impact of the distinctive sound was part of the training. Instructors emphasized that even if the burst didn't hit the target, the sound would force enemies to take cover, disrupting their attack. Ammunition supply was a constant concern for MG42 gunners. At 1,200 rounds per minute, a single gun could exhaust its entire basic load in minutes if fired continuously. German supply doctrine allocated approximately 1,500 rounds per MG42 for a day's combat. This was carried by the gun crew and supporting riflemen. Additional ammunition was stored at company and battalion levels. In defensive positions like Omaha Beach, ammunition was stockpiled before the battle. Gockel's position WN62 had over 10,000 rounds stored in the bunker. This allowed sustained fire throughout the landing, but even this enormous quantity could be exhausted. Several MG42 positions at Omaha Beach ran out of ammunition by midday and had to be resupplied or abandoned. Barrel wear was another concern. The MG42's high rate of fire and powerful cartridge caused significant barrel erosion. A barrel was typically replaced after 5,000 to 8,000 rounds had been fired through it. Worn barrels showed decreased accuracy and increased jamming rates. Units in sustained combat needed regular barrel replacement, which required a functioning supply chain. The gun's performance in different environmental conditions varied. In the desert, sand and dust could cause malfunctions if the weapon wasn't kept clean. German forces in North Africa developed procedures for protecting MG42s from sand, including covering the action when not firing and regular cleaning with available solvents. In Russia, extreme cold caused problems with lubricants freezing. German armorers developed winter-grade lubricants and instructed soldiers to keep minimal oil on the weapon in cold weather. In European mud and rain, the MG42 generally performed well. The simple action and robust construction meant that even when caked with mud, the gun often continued functioning. Soldiers reported that MG42s could be submerged briefly in water, shaken off, and would fire immediately. This reliability was a significant advantage in combat conditions where weapons might be dropped, dragged through mud, or exposed to rain for days. The weapon's weight of 11.6 kilograms was manageable for most soldiers. The gun could be carried by one man, though typically the crew included a gunner, assistant gunner, and ammunition carriers. The assistant gunner carried the spare barrel, cleaning kit, and tools. The ammunition carriers, usually 2 riflemen, carried additional belts. In assault situations, the MG42 could be fired from the hip using a shoulder sling, though this was inaccurate and used primarily for suppression during the final rush to an objective. More commonly, the gun was fired from the bipod in prone position or from the tripod in prepared positions. The psychological impact on German soldiers who operated the MG42 was different from those who faced it. For the gunners, the weapon provided confidence. They knew they possessed exceptional firepower. They knew that in a defensive position, a well-sighted MG42 could stop enemy attacks. This confidence translated to better morale and combat effectiveness. However, MG42 gunners also understood that they were priority targets. Enemy forces would focus on identifying and destroying machine gun positions. Artillery, mortars, tanks, and airstrikes would be directed at MG42s whenever they were located. Life expectancy for machine gunners was often lower than for riflemen. Many gunners were killed or wounded within weeks of entering combat. The captured MG42, examined by Allied intelligence, revealed interesting manufacturing details. The receiver was made from stamped steel parts welded together. The barrel was chrome-plated to reduce erosion. The bolt carrier showed extensive use of stamped parts with minimal machining. The entire weapon could be disassembled without tools for field maintenance. American ordnance officers concluded that the MG42 represented a significant achievement in weapons design and manufacturing. The report recommended that future American machine gun development should consider similar approaches to reduce manufacturing complexity and increase production rates. British intelligence reached similar conclusions. Reports noted that the MG42's rate of fire, while impressive, came with trade-offs in ammunition consumption and barrel life. British doctrine preferred more controllable fire, which the Bren gun provided with its 500-600 round per minute rate. But the report acknowledged that the MG42's psychological effect was significant and should be considered in future weapon development. Soviet captured weapons analysis focused on the manufacturing techniques. Soviet industry was producing millions of weapons using similar stamping and welding methods. The MG42 validated their approach. Post-war Soviet machine gun development incorporated lessons from captured German weapons. The MG42 also influenced small arms doctrine beyond machine guns. The realization that very high rates of fire could be achieved in portable weapons led to development of weapons like the FN-FAL and AK-47, which emphasized high firepower in individual weapons rather than concentrating firepower in dedicated machine guns. The sound of the MG42 became iconic. Even people who never served in World War II recognized the distinctive ripping sound from movies and documentaries. The sound has been recorded and used in films about World War II since the 1940s. It's immediately recognizable and creates an atmosphere of danger and combat intensity. For veterans who faced the weapon in combat, the sound remained memorable decades later. Oral history interviews conducted in the 1980s and 1990s with World War II veterans frequently mention the MG42. Veterans describe hearing the sound and immediately reacting, taking cover without conscious thought. The association between that sound and danger remained strong 40 to 50 years after the war. The nickname Hitler's Buzzsaw appeared in American military publications as early as 1943, after action reports from Tunisia used the term. Training materials warned soldiers about the buzzsaw and included descriptions of the sound and tactics to counter the weapon. By 1944, the nickname was universally recognized in American forces. British soldiers used different nicknames. The Spandau was common, though technically this referred to the MG34 and MG42 collectively, named after the Berlin suburb where many German machine guns were manufactured. The Schmeisser was sometimes used, though this was actually incorrect, as Hugo Schmeisser had nothing to do with MG42 design. German soldiers had their own nicknames for the weapon. Hitler's Jäger, Hitler's saw, was used mirroring the American nickname. Some units called it Knochenbrecher, bone breaker. Soldiers appreciated the weapon's effectiveness and reliability. The MG42's impact on tactical thinking extended into the Cold War period. NATO doctrine in the 1950s and 1960s emphasized machine gun employment Based partially on lessons learned from German tactics in World War II, the US Army revised its infantry organization to include more automatic weapons at the squad level, reflecting the German model of building tactics around sustained firepower. Warsaw Pact forces also studied German machine gun tactics. Soviet advisors examined captured German documents and interviewed German officers who had served on the Eastern Front. Post-war Soviet tactical manuals showed clear influence from German methods, though adapted to Soviet conditions and available equipment. The MG42's service life extended far beyond World War II. Yugoslav forces used the weapon through the Balkan conflicts of the 1990s. African and Middle Eastern conflicts in the 2000s sometimes featured MG42s or variants. The weapon's simplicity and reliability meant that even 50 to 60 years after manufacture, MG42s could still fire effectively. Collectors and military historians prize original MG42s. Museums display them as examples of World War II small arms development. The weapon is recognized as one of the most significant machine gun designs of the 20th century. Multiple books and articles have been written about the MG42's development, employment, and legacy. For the soldiers on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, the technical history and legacy didn't matter. They knew only that when they heard that ripping sound, they had to take cover or die. They knew that crossing the beach meant facing sustained fire from multiple MG42 positions. They knew that casualties would be heavy. Private Miller, crouched behind the seawall at 700 hours on D-Day, understood this. He had watched men die on the beach. He had watched them fall in the water. He understood that the MG42 positions had to be neutralized before the invasion could succeed. But how? The answer came from combined arms coordination and individual courage. Navy destroyers moved dangerously close to shore and engaged bunkers with direct fire. This suppressed some positions. Artillery began falling on German positions, guided by forward observers who had made it to the bluffs. This destroyed some positions. Infantry worked through ravines and up the cliffs, flanking positions that couldn't be engaged directly. This cleared some positions, and individual soldiers, like Miller, advanced despite the fire. They moved when they could. They took cover when they had to. They helped wounded soldiers. They carried ammunition forward. They fought through the German positions one by one. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, American forces had secured Omaha Beach. The MG42 positions had been overrun. The gun crews were dead or captured. The invasion had succeeded despite initial setbacks, but the cost had been high. Approximately 2,400 American casualties at Omaha Beach on D-Day, most from machine gun fire in the first hours of the landing. The MG42 had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had inflicted heavy casualties on attacking forces. It had slowed the advance. It had made the beach a killing ground, but it couldn't stop a determined attack by forces with overwhelming numbers and firepower. The gun's effectiveness had limits. Those limits were reached when American forces brought sufficient firepower to bear and accepted the casualties necessary to close with and destroy the positions. For Obergefreiter Gockel, captured after his position was overrun, the war ended on June 6, 1944. He was interrogated by American intelligence officers who wanted to know about the MG42's operation, ammunition supply, and tactical employment. He was shipped to a POW camp in the United States, where he remained until 1946. He returned to Germany in 1947 and worked as a machinist until retirement. He died in 1992 at age 71. Private Miller continued fighting through France and Germany. He participated in the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. He was present when his unit reached the Elbe River in April 1945. He returned to the United States in November 1945, was discharged, and used the GI Bill to attend college. He became a teacher. He rarely discussed his war experiences. He died in 2003 at age 80. The MG42 that Gockel fired at Omaha Beach was destroyed by American engineers after the position was captured. Standard procedure was to disable captured weapons to prevent their use by bypassed German troops. The gun was probably thrown off the cliff or blown up with explosives. Thousands of MG42s were captured during the war. Some were evaluated by intelligence services, Some were kept as war trophies. Some were destroyed. Some made their way into museums. Many were simply lost to history, destroyed in combat, or discarded after the war ended. The design lived on. The MG3, still in service in 2024, is essentially an MG42 rechambered for modern ammunition. When German soldiers patrol with the Bundeswehr today, they carry machine guns whose basic design is 82 years old. That longevity speaks to the quality of the original design. For historians studying World War II, the MG42 represents an interesting case study in weapons development. The gun succeeded because it addressed a real military need with a practical solution. German forces needed a machine gun that could be mass-produced while maintaining high performance. The MG42 delivered both. It was cheaper and faster to manufacture than previous designs, yet it outperformed them in rate of fire and reliability. The tactical impact was significant but not decisive. The MG42 made German defensive positions more lethal. It increased casualties inflicted on attacking forces. It forced allies to develop new tactics and employ supporting arms more effectively. But it didn't change the war's outcome. Superior Allied numbers, production capacity, and combined arms capabilities eventually overcame German defensive advantages. The psychological impact was perhaps more significant than the material impact. The distinctive sound of the MG42 became synonymous with danger. Soldiers learned to fear that sound. The weapon's reputation spread through combat units. New soldiers heard stories about the Buzzsaw before they encountered it in combat. This created an advantage for German defenders beyond the gun's actual capabilities. But the psychological advantage worked both ways. When Allied soldiers learned to fight effectively against MG42 positions, when they learned the tactics that worked, the fear diminished. By late 1944, experienced Allied units handled MG42 positions routinely. The weapon was still dangerous, still required proper tactics to counter, but it was no longer paralyzing. The MG42 also demonstrated the limits of weapons technology. Even the most effective weapon couldn't overcome disadvantages in numbers, logistics, and strategic position. German forces had superior small arms in many cases, but they couldn't produce enough ammunition, couldn't replace casualties quickly enough, couldn't maintain supply lines, and couldn't match Allied artillery and air power. The MG42 was an excellent weapon, but weapons alone don't win wars. For the engineers and designers who created the MG42, the weapon represented professional success. They had been tasked with creating a machine gun that was better and cheaper than existing designs. They delivered. Dr. Werner Gruner's design team at Grossfuss Metallwarenfabrik created one of the most successful machine gun designs in history. The weapon worked as intended, performed reliably in combat, and influenced machine gun development for decades. For the factory workers who manufactured MG42s, the weapon was just another product. They stamped parts, welded assemblies, tested completed guns, and shipped them to the front. Many probably never saw their products used in combat. They knew they were contributing to the war effort, but the full impact of their work was invisible to them. For the soldiers who carried MG42s into combat, the weapon was a tool. It had to be cleaned, maintained, and operated correctly. It had to be supplied with ammunition. It had to be employed according to tactical doctrine. The gun was heavy to carry, hot after firing, and constantly needed attention. But it worked. When soldiers needed suppressive fire, the MG42 delivered. For the soldiers who faced MG42 fire, the weapon was a threat to be overcome. It required tactics, coordination, and courage to defeat. The sound of 1-200 rounds per minute meant someone was trying to kill you. The response required training, discipline, and the willingness to advance despite casualties. At 06:30 hours on June 6, 1944, when Private Miller first heard that distinctive ripping sound, he didn't know the weapon's technical specifications. He didn't know its rate of fire or manufacturing history. He knew only that the sound meant danger. He had to cross the beach despite that danger. He did. He survived. Thousands of others didn't. The MG42 had done its job, but the invasion succeeded anyway. That outcome summarized the weapon's role in World War II. It was effective within its designed parameters. It inflicted casualties, it influenced tactics, it scared soldiers, but it couldn't change the war's fundamental trajectory. The MG42 was an excellent machine gun. That wasn't enough.